We've also had a couple of questions in from Twitter. Interestingly enough, the first two are from Vodafone employees, so think of that what you will. The first one comes from Terence Eden, and very straightforward. Will LTE kill Wi-Fi?
And supplementary question, what are those things?
Yeah.
What are those things?
What are those
the
things?
definition of what LTE is?
Okay, LTE is effectively the next generation of 3G. It's a faster, or much faster version of 3G. So if in principle we can get up to sort of 20 megabits out of an HSPA network, which is kind of 3G on steroids, then this goes up to sort of 50 to 75 megabits, allegedly up to 100 megabits per cell, in an LTE network. And I think the answer to the question is the combination thesis stands that by the time we get to a rollout of LTE networks, the throughput demand in those cells is going to be very high. And so you're going to be needing to still use the combination. 802.11n, which is the latest Wi-Fi standard, supports up to about 200 megabits worth of throughput, and there are spins on that which take it up to sort of 500 megabits worth of throughput. So we're going to be able to deliver a situation, and certainly in central cities, where we've got very high-speed local access combined with that high-speed macro network. And going back to a comment I made earlier about the fact that in 2015 we're kind of 100-fold up in the volume of data per user that we're pushing through these networks, I think we're going to kind of need that. So given that the roadmap of 3G to HSPA to LTE kind of doubles the throughput capacity of the mobile network, so that means we're kind of 8 times up in terms of speed with LTE, right? Mm-hmm. The user's 100 times up in terms of speed, and let's be conservative and say actually we've got that projection wrong, and so they're only 50 times up in terms of their speed demand. The pace of that growth outpaces the rate of technology supply growth in the cellular networks, and we're definitely going to have something else helping solve the problem. I'm not advocating a world where Wi-Fi wipes out the mobile network. Never have advocated that. It plays a complementary role, and if it ends up supplying 10, 15%, 20% of mobile access demand, it's a pretty big business, and we'd be very happy with that.
Okay, so were you just going to ask
I was just going to ask a follow-up question. The numbers that you mentioned are interesting there, because you're talking about technologies increasing up to 8 and 10 times today's capabilities, but you're talking about demand being 50 times conservatively. Does that mean that actually both technologies are already destined for obsolescence? We already know that they won't meet demand.
Well, this is Moore's law just transposed into the wireless world, right? So we can shrink the size of base stations. We can concentrate a higher number of cells in an area, and we can squeeze more efficiency out of the radio spectrum because we've got better processors and so forth. And that's the way we're going to solve the problem. But there is inevitably going to be some element of capacity crunch that happen. It's a challenge. Of course, everybody's been predicting that we'd run out of processor capacity over the last 30 years, and that hasn't happened. And I'm sure that wireless innovation is going to work well. We've just got to make sure we provide enough radio spectrum to do it within.
Okay, so if I return back to the future trends theme, the second question that we've had in from Twitter is, how do you see a single sign-on for mobile devices shaping up when it comes to seamless Wi-Fi roaming on the cloud network?
Well, we've been successful in achieving a single sign-on today with the iPhone. So if you have an iPhone, it automatically logs onto the Wi-Fi network. You don't see it happen, it just works. All happens in the background. Now, in fact, there are multiple log-ons going on, but it's all hidden from the end user. It just sort of happens. So we've been able to do that because Apple are pretty good at engineering their device and their software and everything else. But we're fortunately moving into a situation where we've got operating systems like Android coming out, and the Nokia guys with Symbian are gradually, eventually opening that stuff up a little bit. So I think that so long as we can actually do some work on the operating systems on those devices, it's going to be possible to put the software smarts onto the device to make that automatic connection happen. There's a second aspect to this, to be techie for a little bit, which is all about smart handover and everything else. So you want to be able to have your voice over IP connection and handover onto Wi-Fi. And I think we're a long way away from that actually happening smoothly. Fortunately, it's a very, very small part of the problem in the sense of the number of users that need that. But it's delivered today, and it's gradually finding its way onto a broader base of devices.
And if I'm not a techie, for the average consumer who maybe's got an iPhone and thinks that this is easy because it happens so seamlessly, as you say, why is this a challenge? Why is this hard in the first place?
It's hard for two reasons. Technically, on a lot of devices, a device needed you to do things to actually tell it to connect to a different network. So if you were using an N95 Nokia device, you physically had to go to a little control panel and say, please connect to that network and not to this network. And that's clearly something that anything beyond a geek isn't going to do, right? And secondly, there were commercial barriers. So if you're paying a different tariff depending on which network you're using, then there's a whole back-end billing system problem where the operator has to know how much to charge you depending on which network you're using, big complexity. So we attacked both of those issues, one by putting a tariff model in place, a charging model in place, which is basically flat rate, which meant that it didn't really matter which network you were using, just solved from a billing point of view. Very simple commercial solution to remove a whole part of technical complexity. And then waiting for the operating systems on the devices to actually get a little bit more with the program and make themselves smart enough to be able to switch the user automatically.
So our final question of the day comes from Jess Greenwood from Contagious magazine, and she says individual users versus corporate users. How many people who aren't corporates are actually paying?
If I split the question into two, about 2 years ago now, maybe about 18 months ago, the network would have been about 70% business users and about 30% what I would call consumer or SME type of users. Now it's probably about 80% consumer SME users and about 20% business users. Now, how many of those consumer SME users are business, using it in a business context? I don't know, right? What I can tell you is about 98% of access points are touched every month by somebody, and there's a lot of access points out there, right? So there's some in some pretty extraneous places. Usage pattern is now very broad across the network. I would say most people using the network are paying, but paying for it indirectly. But quite a high proportion, say the lion's share, who are paying for it because it's in their mobile subscription, right? Though they wouldn't be aware they're necessarily paying for it, right? It's an integrated service. Yeah. And then you've got people that are walking into a free location like a Pret a Manger or McDonald's or what have you, and they're using it for free, right?
Thank you very much for joining us now. Great session, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.